And I'm going to start by introducing Jackie Bennett with Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this Friday to talk about enrichment. GFAS, through our accreditation program and also our other work, engages with all kinds of sanctuaries worldwide that care for equines and wildlife and farmed animals. And we often talk about the importance of enrichment, adding more of it or having different kinds of enrichment, figuring out what works best, making sure it's safe for the animals. And we know it can be a challenge. And so I am delighted to introduce our presenter, Nicola Field, who will talk about enrichment for all. Nick has a wide range of experience caring for captive wildlife and other species, having spent nearly a decade working in zoos before then becoming the Bear and Vet Team Director for Animals Asia's GFAS accredited China Bear Rescue Center, where she worked for 12 years. Nick is the co-founder and managing director of Global Animal Welfare, an organization whose mission is to work with sanctuaries and rescue centers to improve the welfare of animals in captivity, including the development of enrichment programs. Global Animal Welfare has also been a great collaborator with GFAS over the past several years, working with us on our revisions to several volumes of our animal care standards, and most recently facilitating the project resulting in publication earlier this year of the first GFAS standards for cetacean sanctuaries. And so without further delay, I will now turn this over to Nick.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Robin, as well. I've intentionally minimized my own picture. I don't know if you can see me, but I don't want to see me whilst I'm talking. It's great to see so many people join the call today, and it's great to see some familiar names. And as Jackie has said, we've got quite a history working together, and it's been a privilege working alongside GFAS and everything that GFAS does. So a lot of our values align in what we do as well. So it's fantastic. And as Robin was saying, I'm very mindful that the people on this call have all got their own experience and their own expertise, and they'll have their own ideas. So I think it'd be really valuable in the sharing of ideas, because I think so much can come from that. So I will proceed and hopefully have no technical issues. So everybody's familiar with environmental enrichment, I'm quite sure. It's something we talk about so much with keeping animals in captivity, and we've all had some involvement or developed different ideas for the animals in our care, but broadly it's a term used to describe changing a captive animal's environment in a way that improves their quality of life, and it has been widely documented for promoting captive animal welfare. But we're all caretakers of some shape or form with animals, and having animals in sanctuaries or rescue centres is still in a captive situation, and there are challenges. So and we're all, I'm sure, very familiar with some of those challenges: promoting and allowing stimulating choices for our animals, promoting a dynamic environment, ensuring that they've got cognitive challenges, providing them with social opportunities, alleviating boredom, preventing abnormal behaviours. And then thinking very species specific, which I'll come back to throughout this presentation, but also just as an add-on to what's there as well. Also thinking about individual needs as well as what's species specific. So a question I think we can all ask ourselves, and perhaps to have in mind as we move through this, is just to think in terms of can we adequately meet the behaviour and welfare needs of the animals in our care? I know everybody goes above and beyond to meet their needs, but can we do that adequately, and what else can we do? So something to keep in mind. So again, I talked broadly in terms of a definition, and we've all got our ideas of what enrichment is. We think about the spaces that we keep animals in, their enclosures. So the climbing structures, the platforms, the dens, the substrate we use, the puzzle feeders that we use. Perhaps we use training for husbandry reasons, but also sometimes for enrichment purposes. Helping arranging social groupings to promote social interactions and relationships. So these are going to be all things that I know you're all going to be very familiar with. But ultimately, I think we're all on the same page in terms of trying to promote choice in their lives, control in their lives, and complexity in their lives as much as possible. But something just to think about also is the concept of environmental enrichment can often be considered as an extra to our regular day-to-day husbandry, or sometimes even an expensive add-on to what we do. And of course, there are many amazing companies offering amazing puzzle feeders and enrichment toys, which if we're fortunate enough to have access to, can really add value to our animals' lives. Also, if we've got the resources and the expertise, we can build and create some incredible enrichment devices and create wonderful environments for our animals. But I think the thing to really reinforce is it's not an add-on, it's something that can be incorporated into our everyday lives, and also just thinking about what's realistic and available, and still be meeting those needs that we're talking about. So Jackie mentioned this at the beginning, just to give some background of where I'm talking from in terms of what global animal welfare has been doing. So I know there will be a lot of people on today's call that will be US based, but we've been working on an international range of facilities, and certainly from our background working in Asia as well. So I'm going to talk about some different examples of enrichment, and also just some different things that have come to mind in terms of promoting the welfare of animals in sanctuaries and rescue centres from an enrichment perspective, and also thinking about behavioural needs as we move through this. So I just mentioned some of the work that we do. So we've been working with different facilities and trying to help them identify and address welfare needs that will incorporate enrichment. And we talk about a whole range of different topics, but certainly in terms of how we can enrich the lives of the animals in those facilities. But there are a number of challenges that are faced by a lot of sanctuaries and rescue centres. Space is often a big factor. Funding, I'm sure, will resonate with many people as well. Having resources available, and I'll talk about different resources that are available in a few slides in a few moments. Some places really rely on volunteers as well, in terms of what they can deliver for their animals. And also just there are many facilities as well that perhaps don't always have ready access to appropriate animal welfare education and training as well. So all of these things play a part in what we do and the work that we're involved with. So I'm going to keep coming back to those words, specific needs, and talking about species specific and individual needs as well. And every organisation, every facility has very specific needs to their situation. So I've already mentioned funds and resources as well, but also thinking about country specific as well. So there's going to be certain regulations. There might be certain items that are more readily available in some countries as well. And also thinking about whether the residents in the sanctuary are permanent residents or temporary residents is going to be part of the equation. From a behavioural point of view, just some considerations as well. So on a basic level, behaviour is described in terms of the responses animals make to stimuli in their environment, whether that be their physical environment or whether that's other species or whether that's other conspecifics. And much behaviour is adaptive. So in wild animals, this can be an evolutionary process over generations. But behaviours that change in a lifetime are often attributed not to genetics, but to experience and learning as well. So my next question really is, what does that mean for the animals in sanctuaries and rescue centres? And I do appreciate I'm very much talking about this from the perspective of wildlife in sanctuaries and rescue centres, but there may be others on this call that are perhaps from sanctuaries and rescue centres of a different kind, perhaps, for example, farm sanctuaries. But there are some things I think that are relevant to all types, and we can extrapolate across the board. So in terms of sanctuary animals, if we think about it in terms of an animal's behaviour as the consequence of one event being paired with another, I'm sure if everybody on this call was to take a few minutes to talk about their experiences with the animals that they've cared for, they could tell a tale about their animals. So sanctuary animals have history. They've got a background. So for example, it might be that they've come from suboptimal conditions. They may have experienced physical, psychological trauma, maybe maternal deprivation, and so on. They've also significant for them is their human-animal interactions as well, and their experience of humans and those relationships. And then thinking in terms of the individual and their learned responses to their circumstances, their environments, their experiences, versus what is their natural instinct. So there's going to be behavioural variation between individuals, even of the same species, which could affect how that individual is going to respond to different scenarios and environments. And I'm sure you're probably all thinking of different examples as I'm speaking. The other thing that often gets talked about, and this is where I'm thinking in terms of the role that enrichment plays, is behaviour-based husbandry. So resources offered should make evolutionary sense to the animal and address, again, their species-specific behavioural needs. So first of all, does their environment provide opportunity for a specific set of behaviours that are going to be appropriate for that species? So the whether there are species that are in terms of their climbing needs, maybe their feeding needs, scent markings, flying, wallowing, swimming, a whole spectrum of things. But also thinking in terms of husbandry routines and just considering their 24/7 needs. So what I mean in terms of that is just thinking about an animal's biological rhythms and their daily and their seasonal routines. We all, us as the human caretaker, will have our routines. There will be special circumstances, but very often there's going to be a set working day. But how does that fit in with the natural biology of the species that we're caring for? For example, some species may spend more time foraging at dawn and dusk. How does that fit into our routines and our husbandry regimes? And where does enrichment come into play with that? So I mentioned earlier in terms of different resources and what's available for enrichment, and we talked about, you know, that there are very specific companies that can provide different enrichment devices. We obviously provide different things within enclosures. Some of the classic things that get used are things like old fire hose and tires, for example. But perhaps in some places, I know certainly some of the places that I've worked, those materials aren't necessarily so readily available. Having worked in Asia for a long time, bamboo was so available, a wonderful resource for building structures, making puzzle feeders, all kinds of things. A brilliant, cheap and robust resource. However, spending time working in, say, some African sanctuaries, it's not a resource that's so readily available. So what is readily available, what natural resources are available, are all going to be really significant. Also, just some of the things that also made me really think about what can be used as well is you know, a classic item or enrichment thing for many facilities is ice block, especially during the really hot weather. But I have also worked in places where they don't have regular electricity, or perhaps no electricity. So things like ice blocks aren't so readily available. So it's really about working with what's available. And so that's not going to be equal in all places at all times, whether that's between facilities, countries, regions, and so on. I apologise, one of those pictures, the quality seems to have faded, but just as an example, here, in one of the first picture with the grass growing, that's actually a bread pan in Ethiopia. But so utilizing, and they're everywhere, these bread pans, but they utilize that for growing grass to promote and encourage foraging with their primates. So that was something to just give an example. And then something that I think is really significant, and again, I know you'll all have some experience and comments to make on this, but Contrafree loading. So Jensen in the 60s came up with this concept, which in terms of behaviour seen in most animals, that when they're offered a choice between free food or similar food that requires effort, the animal prefers the food that requires effort. And of course, in turn, that increases the level of curiosity, activity, and foraging. And I think this is one of those things that's really significant. And I know it often, husbandry routines and daily routines in general, especially when there's a lot of animals and lots of different species, people are in a hurry or they're busy. So just thinking about even just the presentation of food is really significant. So are there ways that it can, even if it's just scattered widely, can make all the difference? So obviously in the picture there where there's a big pile of vegetables and salad, that's going to be got through very quickly. But that also leads me on to thinking about how human behaviour influences enrichment and enriching of animals. So it has been documented how animals can distinguish familiar from unfamiliar people, and it kind of feeds back to what I was saying before in terms of human-animal relationships and interactions. And animals can differentiate positive interactions with familiar people, such as their carers, and can modify their responses to unfamiliar people, whether it's visitors or new people, new staff, new volunteers. And also those interactions with their carers can really influence how an animal copes with people. And also coming back to that thought that we were saying earlier, just in terms of, you know, all the animals in sanctuaries and rescue centres probably have got got some history, and perhaps their experience of humans hasn't always been a good experience. But also just on a daily basis, thinking about how human behaviour can affect the animals we're caring for, and how it can be enriching or not enriching, and how they can become really conditioned to our routines, our habits, and the way we feed. So the previous slide was just talking about the presentation of food, but also just habits. So I know, working with some sanctuaries, even with the most really complex, comprehensive enrichment programs that are incorporated into the daily husbandry routine, that were robust and varied and stimulating, something that actually cropped up was also just how the caretakers were presenting that enrichment. So they got into a habit, perhaps putting that particular puzzle feeder always on that particular rock, or on that particular post, or that particular structure. So just being mindful of how us as humans, our habits, and how that can affect what we do, and how we care for our animals. And also even just down to another place, I remember we had this conversation, just in terms of timings. And again, I appreciate sometimes where people are very busy, they have a very set schedule in terms of when things happen, whether it's cleaning, feeding, enriching, and so on, in terms of the husbandry. But of course, if you can vary that can be in itself very stimulating and enriching for the animals. But if that's not possible, also just even thinking about how you approach the enclosure and the facility. So this cropped up in a facility where there wasn't so much of scope for varying the times, and we had a whole conversation about how it was a particular group of primates in this situation. They were always sitting, waiting, ready, looking in the direction of where their caretakers were coming from. However, this particular enclosure had maybe 3 or 4 different possible routes to the enclosure. So just mixing it up and changing it up, having the team approach the enclosure from a different route each time, just took that predictability away a little bit for the animals. And also then the other thing to think about is also human body language, voices, interactions with the animals. So, you know, it might be a really positive thing in terms of the tone of voice used. Perhaps people are singing as they're going about their work, but even just how we're interacting with each other could have an influence on the animals in our care as well. And you know, what we might think is perhaps something that's being said in jest, but it might be a certain behavior or a certain tone of voice could actually have a negative impact on the animals. So it's thinking like the animals in our care, ultimately. And then the other thing we wanted to think about today is also priorities for enrichment. And again, here I go again, talking about the species. What are the priorities for the species, and also the individual, but also thinking about the age again. So geriatrics versus juveniles. Also thinking about any special needs, so in terms of their health needs. So are they limited in any way, perhaps with their mobility, or if they're a species that climb? So what are we giving them in their world and in their environment, whether that's from structures or substrate or pools or climbing structures? Are we stretching, whilst we want to stimulate them physically and psychologically, we don't want them to cause harm to themselves or and also thinking about their social dynamics as well. If they're a social species, having that opportunity for social interaction in their environment, but also are they vulnerable? Say, for example, if they've got special health concerns, or they're geriatric. And then also thinking about whether they are individuals or species that are going to be releasable. So are they a permanent resident at the sanctuary or the rescue centre, or are they going to be releasable, and how that influences what enrichment they receive. And then multi-species. So thinking about this from various perspectives, one being that you know, some facilities and sanctuaries are large facilities with lots of different species, so they're needing to think about the needs of a lot of different types of animals, as well as the individuals. Also in terms of groups, it might be that there's multi-species living in the same environment as well. So I showed that picture earlier with an ungulate with tortoises. So how does that affect what's provided for those animals in terms of stimulating them, but also from a safety perspective as well? So that's something, and I'll talk a little bit about safety towards the end as well. But obviously, in terms of priorities, and if you've got lots of different types of animals in your facility, not all animals have the same needs. So you might be thinking in terms of their activity levels. So how much time they spend socializing, how much time they would naturally spend hunting or foraging, and how you address those different species needs. And one way that this can be approached is prioritizing in different groupings of their needs. So it might be, and you could classify this in whichever way you feel is pertinent to what animals that you have. But for example, you could have very high priorities for enrichment for perhaps the species with complex cognition, so maybe apes. Maybe high priorities for the species with high activity naturally, and maybe medium priorities for foraging species. I'm not saying this is the way it should be, but just it could be an example of how you might categorize those priorities and those considerations. And then based on that, in terms of how you plan your enrichment programs, that can correlate with your priority list. So it might be, for example, those species that are in the very high priority, they might receive enrichment twice a day, maybe even more frequently. That's, you know, that this in terms of frequency, that could be much more. It's not set in stone, but that can help you decide in terms of your enrichment program. And then evaluating enrichment all the time. So how are the individuals, how are the species responding to it? So, you know, one of the things that I've talked about in the past with some of the places that we've worked is it's almost a tick box activity. I've done the enrichment, we've done the enrichment, and then the same, I don't know, tire or bamboo feeder or whatever it happens to be has been in the enclosure for a week. Of course, it depends on the species, but does that remain enriching then? So it's more, again, thinking about each day, how different is each day for that animal? How stimulating is it for that day? And of course, by evaluating, it can refine the items that are given, the scheduling, and even changing up the environment as necessary. But obviously within the realms of what's realistic within the resources, the staffing, the volunteers, and the timing that you have. But by doing that and continuously evaluating what enrichment is given, it can continuously enhance the lives of the animals in our care. And then human enrichment. This might seem like a strange thing to say. I've gone too far. Bear with me. I don't know what's happened there. This should be, there we go. Human enrichment. So with a number of the facilities that we've worked with, we've tried to have some sessions around problem solving and creating different ideas for the animals. So it's, again, I appreciate sometimes time is against us, but just taking stock of what the challenges are, what the species, what the individuals that are there, and coming up with ideas. But also, and I'm quite sure everybody, again, listening to this will have some anecdotal story, just how satisfying it is to see an animal engaging with something that you've implemented, whether it's a structure or it's a puzzle feeder or whatever it happens to be. But just the job satisfaction, the enrichment to you, the human, from that perspective. But so it's also about stimulating the psychological aspect of the human caretaker as well. So I think that's something that's always worth thinking about. And then just some other considerations I think that are worth talking about. Sometimes implementing enrichment, environmental enrichment, is something that's seen as a way to treat abnormal behaviours or prevent abnormal behaviours. So it's almost something that's can be seen as a bit more reactionary, almost a panacea to the problems animals may be encountering. But I always think it's good to look at it from a different perspective and think about enrichment and the husbandry overall that's used as a way of a provision of resources, a provision of choices, a way to stimulate animal senses and promote those natural behaviours. So it's far more of a proactive thing rather than treating a problem, essentially. And then what items we use, whether to use natural or unnatural items or materials. And there's, you know, there's lots of different thoughts on this. And I think if you've got residents that are going to be long-term captive residents, then I don't think it matters what type of materials you use, as long as it's safe and it's stimulating to them. That would be my feeling. So as long as it's safe, as long as it's stimulating, as long as it promotes natural behaviours. If you've got releasable animals, or that's the plan, you might need to think a bit more about what items you're giving for enrichment. I don't think it's a reason not to provide environmental enrichment, but just think about the materials that are used. So you know, you're not going to want to be giving them items that perhaps they may encounter after they've been released, that may encourage human-animal conflict, for example, and also perhaps trying to encourage items that are going to promote those natural behaviours. So a classic example would be in terms of structures. You know, if you've got an arboreal species that's going to be moving through trees where branches move, you're not going to give them a lot of fixed structures because the chances are they're going to end up falling out of trees. So things like that is something I think is really important to think about. And then, of course, safety. So it's always something to think about. So monitoring enrichment, and I'm sure everybody's got examples and stories to tell, but it's always something to really think about. I don't think any enrichment is foolproof, but I think we can all take responsibility in terms of how we implement it and how we monitor it. So leaving something in an enclosure for too long, or perhaps if there's not enough variety of lots of different things, what the implications could be in terms of, say, ingesting something that's unhealthy if there's nothing else to do. So also opportunity for, you know, animals maybe getting entangled in items, or just in general injuring themselves maybe on a nail, or whatever it happens to be. But it's always really thinking along the lines of safety, and where possible maximizing, of course, the benefits for that enrichment, but minimizing the risks. So how is that built into a schedule? So I've actually gone through that a bit quicker than I thought, but like I said at the beginning, I think it's really valuable for people to be able to share their experiences, but also obviously questions as well. So I haven't looked at the chat whilst I've been talking, but I know Robin has been monitoring what people have been putting in there. But I'd love to hear what other people's experiences are, or if anyone's got any particular questions based on what I've said today.
Well, I would invite anyone to put in their questions or comments. And also, if there's a particular enrichment that you think has worked particularly well for an animal in your care for a particular species, just drop a note in the chat and let us know what it is. So while we're waiting for that, Nick, while I was listening, I was writing down a couple of questions. There are topics that I know you and I have talked about before. But let me just start with one. You talked about consideration of social dynamics, but I think in so many situations we are challenged by animals that have to be singly housed for a particular reason, whether it be because of behavior or a lack of mobility, age, health reasons. It may be even more challenging for wildlife, but there are situations for equines and farm animals where they really have to be separate. And any suggestions or comments on how you might approach that singly housed animal that really needs more stimulation because they're not getting the stimulation of being in a social group?
Yeah, that's a really it's a big one, and it is definitely a big challenge. And particularly when I was asking that question at the beginning about how we can adequately meet the needs of the animals in our care. Certainly, I think doing more in terms of enrichment. So, you know, when I was talking about priorities and planning and frequency, perhaps doing more, obviously it's going to depend on the species and perhaps the individual's needs as well. And I thought of something else then, and it's just gone out of my head. But the frequency, and perhaps also thinking that was it, thinking about the human-animal relationship part as well. Is there more that can be done with that individual? If perhaps they're normally a social species, can there be more done in terms of maybe husbandry training, just to have, so they've got that contact? It might also be about where they're housed as well, in proximity to other conspecifics or other individuals. Can there be any stimulation in that way? And is it even possible in terms of multi-species? Obviously that's not always appropriate, and care should be taken with that, but it might be that perhaps there is opportunity for social interaction in a different way like that. So and I'd love to hear what other people have done around that as well.
Now, Kenya has a comment in the Q&A noting that location of animals in habitats next to other species is great enrichment. For example, smell or noises or visual interactions. And I think that goes to what you were saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely concur with you, Kenya. I think that's a brilliant way forward if there isn't the opportunity. And conversely, also, you might find in a captive situation that you've got species that perhaps naturally might be more solitary, actually get more out of having some socialization. Again, needing to be very, very careful, but there could be some stimulation from being with other conspecifics or other individuals that perhaps wouldn't necessarily happen in a more wild or natural setting.
We have a question from Karina. What has been your biggest challenges implementing enrichment in the various places you have worked?
Oh gosh. The biggest challenge, there's lots of different types of challenge, I think. I'm just thinking. I think recognizing recognizing the available. I think recognizing that not always everything's so readily available, and perhaps also in some places, and bearing in mind that we've worked in some countries where perhaps the human caretakers, their own how do I word it, but their own home life, or what's so readily available to them, they might not have so much access to for their own lives, their families' lives. So suggesting putting something into an enclosure perhaps is actually deemed quite expensive to the human caretaker, might seem almost a bit extreme to the animals that they're caring for. And perhaps also in terms of challenges is also just encouraging people to think like the animals in their care. But I think the longer anyone spends around animals, the more appreciation they have of the animals' needs and the stimulation they need. I've waffled a bit on that question. Thanks, Karina.
Marcia followed up with a great comment. The measurement of keeper time spent making enrichment items versus the enjoyment time when given to the animal is probably an important factor to bear in mind to ensure maximum benefit and use of time. And I think we all know about the instances where you give enrichment to an animal and it's destroyed in a matter of sometimes seconds, and that's it. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable comment. But I also think as well, just as an extension of that I've heard it be said before where maybe some new type of enrichment has been tried with an animal and they don't seem very interested. And I actually would argue that that's still enriching because they've made a choice about that item. It might be that they'll learn to interact with that later. They may come to it later. But even just ignoring something, I think, is enriching in itself.
Yeah. It leads to a question I wanted to ask you about volunteer programs, because I know so many sanctuaries have volunteer programs and often they use volunteers to help with enrichment, which of course helps with having more resources so it's not keeper time. Any comments you have on that or suggestions for successfully using volunteers as part of creating and managing an enrichment program, or examples where that has worked particularly well for you?
I think it can only be a valuable thing in terms of it's fresh ideas, it's fresh people power as well, additional people power to implement things. I think I always have concern with kind of conversely to that, in terms of there's so much value from it, but also it's not something that becomes, like I said earlier, enrichment not being the add-on. I always think there's a danger if volunteers are the source of the enrichment and there is no other enrichment. So without volunteers, enrichment doesn't happen. And certainly some of the places that we've worked during COVID, they didn't have the same steady stream of volunteers. So potentially it was there was disadvantages to the animals as well. And I also think also capturing those ideas for volunteers. People come and go and they have some incredible ideas, but also ensuring that those ideas are captured, whether they're documented or whether they're implemented at another time, I think is really important. So yeah, just some initial comments on that.
We have a bunch of comments and questions coming in the Q&A, but we have a conversation starting with the question from Laura. Any ideas for using animal scents for social enrichment? Any animal scent sprays I found are derived from animals, which is against our sanctuary's policy.
So let me just, I'm just reading it as well. So you're saying that any animal scent sprays that have come from animals are against animal the sanctuary's policy. I mean, scents don't have to come from, if I'm reading and understanding that correctly, I mean, scent enrichment doesn't necessarily have to be derived from other animals. You know, as long as we consider safety and things that are not toxic, but you know, perhaps some aromatherapy type oils used in sprays. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding you, Laura, so I hope I'm answering the question. I see there's some comments there in terms of rotation as well, and safety. Perfume, I see Kenya's mentioned perfume. Yes, that can be. I would always think about the toxicity, but yeah, certainly even down to some types of food items that maybe could be blended down into some kind of spray form can be quite impactful as well.
Right. It looks like that chat will keep going. So we're
Yeah.
going to another question in that I also want to ask you about. You know, you mentioned one facility having a complex and comprehensive program, and I wrote a note evaluation. And so Raquel also wrote suggestions on how to monitor the success of enrichment implementation. Christina noted observing and checking the time the animal uses it. But how do you determine if an enrichment program is being successful?
Yes, good question. And certainly in terms of quantifying, and if you have the luxury of students, or again coming back to the volunteers, maybe utilizing very specific behavioral observations, that could be a really good way of monitoring success. But certainly along the lines of some of the comments that have already been made in terms of how long an item is utilized as well, and also just how anything is interacted with. So and is it the same for all individuals? I think is going to be a good way. I'm not sure if that completely answers the question. I'd love to hear how other people have monitored and assessed how successful enrichment item use has been, or enriching enclosures in general.
Well, let me follow up on that, because we talked a little bit earlier about singly housed animals and the concerns with that. But what about large social groups? I mean, I know for Animals Asia, for example, there would be large groups of bears in an enclosure, and you have some enrichment in there. Not everyone's using it, or not everyone's using it the same way. So how do you deal with that when evaluating your program and designing your program for a larger social group of animals?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so well, the first thing I would say is having enough. So I think I was talking about it in the context of safety first of all, but certainly having enough of enrichment for the number of individuals in the space is going to be really important, because certainly from a competition perspective as well. And then in terms of evaluating the success of that enrichment, again, with a big group of animals, it could be that there may be more dominant individuals that are always accessing that enrichment more than others. So again, in terms of behavioural monitoring, but also ensuring that, in terms of the presentation, the placing, the quantity and the frequency, it's extensive enough that every individual has the opportunity, even if the opportunity is to do something else. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jackie.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Tanya has a question in. I'm not sure, maybe we need a little more information. What has worked best for anyone with group dynamics, prides, without having any complications? And maybe that kind of goes to the same issue about having enrichment in a larger social group of animals. Is that a good way of framing that, Kenya?
Maybe you could elaborate, Kenya. I mean, I'd certainly say, without knowing the full implications of your question, I'd certainly say having plenty of items. Also, I think probably thinking about social and group dynamics, thinking about how enrichment works in introductions and integrations, I think is quite important to consider. So certainly with ensuring animals that are being integrated for the first time or introduced for the first time, ensuring that they're sufficiently satiated in terms of food, but also not having, if there is going to be any enrichment, you're not having stuff that's going to be there's going to be a lot of competition over, but perhaps it helps with redirecting frustrations would be valuable. I don't know if that kind of plays into your question, Kenya.
Well, she did put the comment below about, for example, possessive behaviors, which I think is what you addressed. But any other thoughts or your experience, how you've addressed when you have a social group and someone, I guess, is hoarding the enrichment, or if it's causing too much struggle or fighting within the group?
I think it's just having plenty of variation, but also, I mean, it also plays into, if there are group dynamics, whether it's enrichment, also just monitoring those dynamics in general, because things can be shifting and changing all the time between individuals. So whether it's about the enrichment or whether it's about something else within the social dynamic, monitoring that closely, and whether it's actually about the complexities of the relationships between those individuals. But certainly from an enrichment point of view and resource point of view, having plenty so that avoiding competition is what I would say.
And Tracy added a comment suggesting station training can help.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so station training, husbandry training of different kinds can be valuable in terms of that interaction, stimulation, and with different situations like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Marcia put in a great comment. One fascinating thing we once had was a raised bed of differing herbs covered with mesh in a primate enclosure where they could choose and pick differing herbs to nibble as they grew. And you saw individual preferences there. Thank you for sharing that, Marcia. That's a great example.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, great idea.
And Emily says that she's done that for chickens and goats as well.
Nice.
Right. We should put together an enrichment recipe book.
Yeah.
With all of these. Send in your best recipes. We'll put them together. These are great examples. Thanks, everyone.
It'd be good. I know I didn't include any film because I thought that would be a good addition, but it'd be fantastic getting lots of different filmed examples from different people. in a compilation. I think that could be really fascinating and helpful.
I'm just looking to see what we might have missed. So Christina had put in, oops, just popped away, but I didn't want to skip it. Christina had put in a comment a little while ago about the importance of considering keeper tasks when you put a kind of enrichment in a particular spot. Difficult to change, difficult to refill, difficult to clean. Point out they become more poop collectors than enrichment because of the difficulty, I guess, of managing it once it's in an enclosure.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously going to be very it's going to be a challenge, there's no question, and that's obviously going to be very specific to different facilities and different enclosures. But yeah, just thinking as much as possible, and I appreciate sometimes limited on what the options are and the space you can utilize, but just how that can be varied as much as possible, or whether there's actually something else that could be implemented to avoid that. Yeah.
A few more in here, a few minutes left. So let me see if I can get to them. Someone was asking for enrichment suggestions for captive apex predators to stimulate hunting behavior safely. I don't know if anyone has suggestions.
I was just waiting to see if people would respond to that, and then I've lost the place.
It is anonymous attendee. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that or make any particular suggestions on enrichment to stimulate hunting behavior.
Yeah, it's a challenging one. I mean, I know different facilities maybe have had things on, kind of bungee straps, or whether it's meat items or pulley systems, for example, but also just in terms of maybe even types of sprays as well, coming back to the scents. But I think without question, it's a very challenging in terms of adequately meeting apex predator stimulation as
We've
well.
got some great suggestions coming in. Remote control truck to run along the outside of the habitat for them to chase. Safe way to do it. Jolly balls, cardboard giraffe. Alyssa, I'd love to hear more about this. A great cardboard giraffe for the lions. Female lion had a great time taking it down.
Excellent.
Or a scent trail for hidden food. Definitely going to keep this chat. These are great ideas. Thank you everyone for contributing to that. All right. I have a question about ducks and geese. We're getting at the end of the hour. Laura found a website recently that listed some fresh herbs that ducks enjoy. Please forward that to us when you can. We can share that.
We'll see about the zip line idea, Emily. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. I love this conversation. I'd like to see it keep going. But Robin, I think you said that we're going to be sharing the chat. Are we sharing the Q&A? Is that possible?
Yes, I will try to share both of those so that everybody can have all of this information to read through as you have more time. I should be sending copies of the chat and the Q&A as well as the link to the recording, hopefully early next week.
Great.
Fantastic. And thank you everybody for joining and sharing the ideas. And equally, if anyone wants anything or would like to know more about global animal welfare, please do get in touch as well.
And thank you, Nick, for putting this together and sharing your experience. We always have a great time talking about enrichment and other things. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Nick and Jackie, and thank you everybody for attending. I hope you all have a great weekend. I will go ahead and close this down now, if that's okay with everyone.
Yep. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Nick.